Okay, in this lesson, we are going to explore the useEffect hook. Now, the useEffect hook is going to be different from the useState hook. And what the useEffect hook does is it gives us the ability to fire side effects inside of our functional components. But before we explore what that means, let's just look at what we are trying to build so that we know what we're doing with this useEffect hook. So right now we have some input. And depending on the name that you type into this input, we're going to make an API request to our JSON placeholder to get some specific user in this user list by the name of this user, specifically the username. So if we look at the code, we haven't written it yet, but the structure of the HTML is that we have some simple input. And right now, all we've done is we've leveraged the useState hook that we just learned. So this is a good chance also for us to continue looking at both hooks in unison, but also for us to see how useState hook might be used in a real-world application. Now, we have some user object that we're setting with our setUser, right? These two parameters that we get back from useState. So we're calling useState for this user state value that we want, and the default value will be null. But what we expect to get back, of course, is some object. Now, the next thing we're going to set is this query, right? So our search query, what the user types in with their input. And here we're going to set our setSearchQuery value as well. So when useState default value is Brett, whenever the user types something different, that will be the new string value that's going to be in our search query state. The main difference is that instead of setting this as a default value of an empty string, we set it as Brett. And that's why when we refresh, we get Brett right here. So now, before we actually proceed with the useEffect, all we have done is that in our input, we set our value to our search query value, right? So we're leveraging internal state. And then whenever this value changes, we get the target and the value itself and then put it into our search query value using the search query property. Now, if a user exists and it's not null, right, we just simply display a div and show the name, username, and email. Otherwise, if user is null, we just show a p tag that says no user found. In order for us to leverage our useEffect hook, we got to bring it in first. And then we got to put it into our component. Now, useEffect is different from useState in the sense that it does not get back any value. Instead, what it does is it gets a function that gets called whenever the component changes, or whenever the component updates and re-renders. So let me show you what this means. Let's say we have some function that console logs hello. That's all it does. When our component mounts for the first time, this effect will fire, the one that we just passed here, because this is mimicking our component did mount lifecycle method. So the effect fires, but it will also fire, as we notice, whenever our component re-renders. And the reason our component re-renders is because we're firing off our setSearchQuery method, which is similar to calling setState. As you remember in a class component, whenever you call setState, the render method gets called. So just like that method, our useState does a similar thing. Whenever any of our set parameters from our useState gets called, it does re-render and update the component. As a result, the useEffect effects will also fire. So that's the thing to remember, is that our useEffect is not just for mounting, is not just for mimicking component did mount lifecycle methods, but also for any of the update lifecycle methods that fire whenever render gets called. Now, you might be wondering, Well, what if we don't want to fire our useEffect method on every update? What if we only want to fire it in a way that's similar to component_did_mount? Well, the way we would do that is we would pass in a secondary parameter to useEffect. Now, this secondary parameter will be an array. And what this array takes is properties that this effect has access to that will not trigger a re-render. So for example, if inside of here, we only want to trigger a useEffect re-render if our search query value changes, right? Then we will see that, of course, we're re-rendering our effect, right? Because our search query property has changed. But let's say we only want it to fire when our user property changes. Well, now we'll see that we're no longer getting the effect, right? It only fires the first time when our actual component mounted. Because the user state here, this value was brand new. That's a thing to keep in mind. This array is taking an array of properties that we want to watch, and our effect only fires if those properties ever change. And usually we want it in such a way so that these properties are going to be properties that our function, our useEffect function, is dependent on. So we'll talk about this once we actually implement the feature. But if, for example, we wanted only our effect to fire simply the one time when it mounted, we pass in an empty array, because what we're saying is that I want this effect to depend on nothing. So if this array is saying only render our useEffect again whenever anything in this array property-wise changes, if it's an empty array, then we're not watching for anything. So no matter what changes, our useEffect does not fire again because it's not firing at all unless anything changes, and because we're not watching anything, right, then we don't care. So now we, of course, fire the first time, but then we don't fire for any subsequent changes. Now, how do we actually do our fetch? Well, if we were to use our async await function, you would probably think that what we should do is write an async function. But if we do this, we'll actually see that we do get an error. And the error is that the effect function must not return anything besides what is used for cleanup. Now, there's two caveats here to look at. The first is that the effect function must not return anything but the function. What does this mean? Well, the function that we pass to useEffect, async functions actually return us an async func object. So what this is saying is that when we declare our async func method, we're actually returning back an async func object, which useEffect does not want. So how do we actually use an async await function in our useEffect function? Well, what we would do is return a function that returns our async function. So here we can return a function and then set a new fetch func, which is equal to async await, which is where we'll perform our fetch. So here's what we'll do. We are going to call our await for fetching to our JSON placeholder string because we're trying to get the user. And we're going to say where the name, or let's say the username, equals, and then here we're going to use our property of search query. So essentially what the user types in right here. Oops, I'm using the wrong string. So we're doing string interpolation. And we want to set this equal to our response. Next, what we want to do is we want to convert this to JSON. Whereas JSON equals response.json. And we want to await this as well. Now, the thing to remember here is what we get back from this URL will be an array. So even if we do, let's say we want Brett. If we do users, comma, username equals Brett, we see that this is still an array. So we always want the first object. So here's what we're going to do. We are simply going to say, of course, we're going to set our user, right, when we get this JSON object back. And we're going to pluck the first user. And then inside of this function, we're just going to call our fetch func. We're not going to actually return it. We're just going to call it. And now what will happen is that we will, so let's actually get rid of that first, right? Because I need to point out something. We will pretty much just save this. And what will happen is that when our component mounts, we are going to call this fetch func method, which will fetch from the JSON based on the search query. It'll give us back the response. We convert it to JSON, and then we call set user. But what happens when we save this? If we look, we're actually going to see, if I console log this, we see that we're going crazy. We keep firing this over and over and over and over again. Why is that? Well, that's something we have to understand about the way that this useEffect works. What's happening is that we are firing off this effect whenever the component gets re-rendered, right? Or the component updates. But our component updates whenever we set the state. And we set the state, we're setting our user state whenever this value comes in, whenever our user comes in. So what happens is that the component mounts for the first time. We fetch from this URL using the Brett state. We get back our object, and then we set our user, which in turn re-renders our component, and then triggers our effect again. And then we research for the user, re-get the response, reset the value, right? Calling set state again, and then this triggers another re-render, and onwards and onwards and onwards and onwards and onwards, because we keep setting the user inside of our effect. So because of this, this is a thing we have to watch out for, and explicitly why they give us this array. Because what we're trying to say in this array is that I want you to watch for properties that I might have access to inside of my function, that only if that value changes will I then update this effect. If that property doesn't change, then I don't want to refire this effect. Now, one way that we can do this is, of course, if we just pass in this empty string, or sorry, this empty array. If I save, we fire for the first time, but now the effect doesn't fire again, right? No matter what, even if I change this, right, you see that nothing is happening. Well, this is pretty much how we would mimic a component did mount method to fetch code by passing an empty array. But we want to trigger a change whenever we type anything in. So the way for us to do that is we simply say whenever the search query value changes, then I want you to actually refire this effect. So now, if I type, you'll see that we're updating. And if I were to choose another user, then we are able to update our state with our new user. So this is pretty much the main thing of useEffect, is just how we have to be careful of what properties we're using inside of the function that we pass useEffect that may cause an infinite loop inside of our component, or how we can use it in order to fire and represent our component did mount methods. But this is pretty much it. Now, they're pretty simple when you look at them, but they are very complicated in how we can utilize them to replace features in our application. So let's actually use what we've learned with useState and useEffect to replace some of the features inside of our clothing application. And we'll do that in the next lesson.